ophthalmologist at Shroff Charity Eye Hospital. She has been here since 3 years and a very great asset to the department and in charge of the neuro-ophthalmology department. So she will speak on amblyopia treatment and pedic studies.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you, ma'am. Are my slides visible as full screen?
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes.
So I would be discussing about amblyopia and pedic studies. So I've divided my presentation into 3 parts. The first part will be a small introduction of amblyopia and pedic, and then the key features of pedic, and then the amblyopia treatment studies. So as we all know, amblyopia is defined as a unilateral or bilateral decrease of visual acuity caused by deprivation of pattern vision or abnormal binocular interaction for which no cause can be detected by physical examination of the eye. Historically, the mainstay of treatment has been patching, as we all know that, and that has been following 2 classical norms, that is, the more the better, the earlier the better, wherein earlier the better involves the concept of critical period, wherein they believe that we have to do patching just before 9 years of age, and also a simultaneous patching along with the optical correction. And more the better includes the full-time occlusion depending upon the age, but it has its own demerits, as we have seen. There may be loss of many patients to treatment due to poor compliance and failure to provide any options for older children. Moreover, the amblyopia studies in the past, majority of them are retrospective. They did not counter the confounding factors. There was no uniformity in visual acuity testing methods. They had variation in definition of success, and the effect of spectacles was neglected. So with this, the pedic group was evolved. Pedic is Pediatric Eye Disease Investigator Group, which is a network of both ophthalmologists and optometrists. Network operating in over 100 sites, formed in 1997, funded by the National Eye Institute, which has given us an evidence-based approach regarding amblyopia, strabismus, and other pediatric disorders. The questions addressed by pedic were, how well do glasses alone treat amblyopia? What was the role of patching? And if patching is appropriate, how many daily hours of prescribed patching? What happens when patching is stopped? Does atropine work equally? And how often do we need to instill atropine? Does patching work in older children? Now, to answer these questions, they have done studies which are numbered as ATS 1 to 20 in studying all the questions which has been addressed. So PDIC has some common inclusion criteria and their exclusion criteria. So we will cover them as the key features. So most of them are RCTs, but few of them are also prospective observation studies. They had well-defined protocols. They included unilateral amblyopia, which involved both strabismic and anisometropic or mixed, and bilateral isometropic refractive amblyopia was also studied. However, they did not study deprivational amblyopia. For unilateral amblyopia, they have defined as visual acuity in the amblyopic eye 20/40 or less, interocular acuity difference greater than equal to 0.3 logmar or 3 lines of difference, BCVA in the sound eye 20/40 or better. Moderate amblyopia was defined as 20/40 to 20/100, and severe amblyopia was defined as 20/100 to 20/400. These are their definitions for anisometropic, strabismic, combined amblyopia, and bilateral refractive amblyopia. All of the children had undergone full cycloplegic correction of astigmatism, myopia, anisometropia, and hyperopia, depending upon the presence of esotropia and absence of esotropia. The other eligibility criteria, apart from age and vision, was all of them had completed spectacle phase or were already in optimal correction for at least 16 weeks. And they excluded if they had undergone any amblyopia treatment other than spectacles in the past month, or more than 1 month of amblyopia treatment in the past 6 months. If children were undergoing current vision therapy or orthoptics, if there was any ocular cause for reduced visual acuity, myopia more than a spherical equivalent of greater than 6 diopters, and prior intraocular refractive surgery, and if there was any allergy to patch or bandage. Vision assessment was done using single surrounded HOTV optotypes using an electronic visual acuity tester for children within 3 to 6 years old, and for children older through 7 years, ETDRS chart was used. Primary outcome was the masked amblyopic eye. The person who was assessing the visual acuity was masked to the participants. So the visual acuity score at the designated follow-up was the primary outcome, and the secondary outcome was the proportion of patients with greater than equal to 20/25 visual acuity and the proportion improving by 15 or more letters from the baseline. So with this overview, now we see how did they answer these questions. So do we really know that patching works? This was studied in ATS treatment study 5, phase 2, which was a randomized control trial to evaluate 2 hours of daily patching for strabismic and anisometropic amblyopia of 3 to 7 years old, where they have randomized them into 2 groups. 2 hours of daily patching with near activity or spectacle alone. And they found that in the first group, where they had given patching, 1.1 line was improved after 5 weeks compared to 0.5 lines in the control group. And therefore they concluded that after a period of treatment with spectacles, 2 hours of daily patching combined with 1 hour of near visual activities modestly improves moderate to severe amblyopia in 3 to 7 years of old. The second question was, how many daily hours of prescribed patching are necessary? This was again answered by ATS 2A and 2B, where 2A was a randomized trial of prescribed patching regimens for treatment of severe amblyopia comparing full-time patching versus part-time patching, full-time or 6 hours of patching. 2B was a randomized trial of comparing 6 hours versus 2 hours for moderate amblyopia. And in 2A, they found that visual acuity in the amblyopic eye after 4 months was similar amount had improvement was noted in both the groups, 4.8 lines in the 6-hour group and 4.7 lines in the full-time group. 6 hours of prescribed daily patching definitely produces an improvement, but that is of similar magnitude. Similarly, in ATS2B also, they found that there was similar improvement on an average of 2.4 lines in each group. Visual acuity was at least 20/32 after 4-month follow-up and improved by 3 or more lines in 62%. So now comes, is there any alternative to patching? Here comes the role of atropine. This was studied in ATS1, where they included children of 3 to 7 years of old who underwent either 6 hours of patching or daily 1% atropine and followed up for 6 months. And they found that there were 3.2 lines improvement in the patching group versus 2.8 lines improvement in the atropine group. And greater than 20/25 visual acuity was in 79% versus 74%, which was quite comparable. So they concluded that there was substantial improvement in amblyopic eye visual acuity with both treatments. However, the improvement was more rapid in the patching group. There was no difference between groups in amblyopic eye acuity after 2 years of age. So if atropine has proven to be effective now, how often does one need to instill atropine? For this, ATS4 came up, which said that they compared daily versus weekend atropine followed up for 4 months in 3 to 7 years of age group, and they found that 2.3 lines improvement was noted in both groups. Greater than equal to 20/25 visual acuity was seen in 49% of daily atropine versus 53% of weekend atropine. So definitely weekend atropine is a better option. Now, role of atropine and plano glasses. For this, ATS8 study has answered it, where weekend atropine plus plano lenses, so it was augmented with plano lenses in the sound eye versus weekend atropine, 4 months followed up after correcting hyperopia greater than equal to 1.5 diopters, and they found that was comparable improvement of 2.8 lines in the combined group versus 2.4 lines only if atropine was given, weekend atropine. And the effect on sound eye was there was a drop in 1 line visual acuity in 17% in the combined group versus 4%. However, all but one reversed on follow-up. Now, what about older children? Does amblyopia therapy work in these children? To answer this, ATS3 is there, which is a randomized trial from 7 to 17 years. So they had divided the children into 2 groups, 7 to 12 year age and 13 to 17 years. And they found that the responders means where they had greater than 2 lines of visual acuity improvement after treatment. So 53% of the treatment group were responders in 7 to 12 year old with 25% of optical correction, whereas in 13 to 17 years age group, there was no significant improvement. So for patients aged 7 to 12 years, prescribing 2 to 6 hours per day of patching with near activity and atropine can improve visual acuity even if amblyopia has been previously treated. But for 13 to 17 years, patching of 2 to 6 hours per day with near visual activities may improve visual acuity only if the amblyopia was not previously treatment. So this studied the augmented modality effect. Now, because augmented modality found was effective, they went ahead to check the single modality, that is atropine and patching, compared the effectiveness of 2 hours of daily patching versus weekend administration of 1% atropine, and they found that mean visual acuity improvement was essentially the same in both the groups after 17 weeks of treatment. So what happens when the treatment is stopped? To answer this, there's ATS-2C. So ATS-2C was a study where 156 children were followed up after 3 months of complete treatment, either by atropine or by patching, and off treatment for 52 weeks. And then they noted whether there was any deterioration of vision by 2 lines. And they found that when patching is stopped, there was 25% recurrence. If atropine was stopped, there was 21% recurrence. And they concluded that approximately 25% experienced a recurrence during the first year of treatment. And majority of the recurrences were seen in children less than 8 years old. So younger children had more recurrence and within 3 months. Hence, the early follow-up is critical. Recurrence is more if patching is stopped abruptly, and this suggests that weaning is beneficial. So what about residual amblyopia? For this, there were 2 studies where they said that if there is residual amblyopia, you can augment it by increasing the dosage of patching, or you can add plano lens if atropine was the therapy. So here in the first study, they found that if the mean visual acuity improvement at 10 weeks was 1.2 lines in the group that had increased patching. So from 2 hours, if the patching was increased to 6 hours when there was a refractory or no response to preliminary patching treatment, the improvement was by 1.2 lines versus 0.5 lines in the group that continued with 2 hours patching. And if addition of plano lens was there, there was some difference of 1.1 line versus 0.6 line, but it was not statistically significant, and the confidence interval was large. But before this, all of us in our practice should remember that once we see that there is residual amblyopia, check compliance, redo cycloplegic refraction to assure there is no uncorrected refractive error, reassess ocular structures that we are not missing on any pathology, and then augment or interchange therapy. Now, optical correction for bilateral refractive amblyopia was studied in ATS-7, which was a prospective observational study, and in 3 to 10-year-old children who were not treated with glasses, if they had an isometric amblyopia with high hyperopia greater than equal to 4 spherical equivalent, or astigmatism greater than equal to 2 diopters within an amblyopia of a range 2040 to 2000, they found that there was an improvement of 4 lines. 74% of them achieved binocular visual acuity of 20/25 or better, but this improvement was seen up to 1 year in the same children. So at least they should be followed up for 1 year before we stop. So role of binocular iPad games. This was studied in the recent ATS-18, where they compared 385 children into 2 groups, a binocular group and patching group. Binocular groups, they were given a binocular iPad game prescribed for 1 hour per day versus patching of the fellow eye for 2 hours per day. And they were again 2040 to 2200 range because of strabismus or anisometropia. Follow-up at 16 weeks. And at 16 weeks, they found that the mean amblyopic visual acuity improved 1.05 lines in the binocular group versus 1.35 lines. Though they showed that in 5 to less than 7 years, there was some improvement, but a post-hoc analysis showed that visual acuity improvement in this particular binocular iPad treatment was not as good as with 2 hours of prescribed daily patching. The upcoming studies, which results are not yet out, are amblyopia treatment study 19, which compares the efficacy and safety of surgical treatment, excimer laser, versus non-surgical treatment for anisometropic amblyopia in children who have failed conventional treatment due to non-compliance or response, and the DIGRUSH game, where 1 hour of binocular gameplay 5 days per week plus spectacle correction versus only spectacle correction is being studied where the treatment is on. So with this, I conclude that PEDIG has given us an evidence-based approach, and now we should answer that not the historical dogma, but to these questions, we should follow the current perspective. The mainstay of amblyopia treatment is first optimal refractive correction. The timing of refractive correction is occlusion prescribed after the gains from optical treatment has effect. So a 6 weeks window period has to be given. Patching dosage for moderate amblyopia start with 2 hours and can increase if needed. For severe, start with 6 hours, and 2 hours is effective in some cases. Atropine penalization can also be used as a first-line treatment or as an alternative to patching or in patching failures, and can be used both in moderate to severe cases, younger, older children. The upper age limit is not established. Recurrence of amblyopia after treatment to cessation, as it was noted historically, that there's high likelihood, we do not note it. Vast majority of our children do not regret. So this is what we should follow in our practice. Thank you.
Thank you, Sovita, for an excellent presentation. I think it was very well covered, a comprehensive presentation about the whole ATS. So now, since we have been updated about the ATS, but I would just like to add few points. Dr. Manjula can and Dr. Prachi can add if any they want to highlight any feature of the ATS study. The important thing is that we need to give refractive adaptation for 6 weeks. In mild cases only do I proceed with 2-hour patching, whereas in moderate to severe amblyopia, we need to give part-time occlusion around 6 to 8 hours. We cannot do 2 hours. At least I found that 2 hours patching in a severe amblyopia, it has not worked. It takes time to improve. If there is non-compliance, then of course atropine penalization, but I again find that it does not work so much in severe amblyopia, because then the vision of the is still better in the eye which is penalized. And so the daily, we would prefer, mostly we prefer the daily atropine rather than the weekend atropine. The recurrence is common, so always to say that we need to wean off slowly. We should not wean off at once. We should wean off, say, once you have achieved equal vision, then also wean off by doing around 2 hours patching. Say if it is having small amount of microtropia or severe anisometropic amblyopia, then I think you should give at least 2 hours patching, management weaning patching, or what I say is that a small amount of near activities patching for at least till 8 years of age. And whenever there's a residual, cyclorefraction has to be repeated. So any more points any of both of you want to add, Dr. Prachi, Dr. Manjula, before Dr. Prachi can share?
As far as older children, the thing what ATS studies said is if they have not undergone any patching in the past, more than 13 years, you find that the improvement is better than those children who have undergone patching. So if you have first-time amblyopes presenting at 13 or more, you can still patch or you can do your conventional amblyopic treatment and you will find a response, rather than thinking that let us not do anything, the child has become older, there may not be any response. So even our ATS studies have found out that older children who haven't been patched previously, they have had acuity improvement after patching. So that's a point to be noted. Other than that, as you said, Suma, everything else seems to be fine. The number of hours, and according to even the ATS studies, it is not just the number of hours, we have to also include near vision activities. So it is 2 hours of patching for moderate amblyopia with 1 hour of near vision activity. Similarly, severe amblyopia, 6 hours of patching with 1 to 2 hours of near vision activity. We have to emphasize to the parents that near vision activities are very important in improvement of visual acuity. It is not just the number of hours.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Manjula. I think we can go to the next presentation, Dr. Prachi.
Yes.
So now in India, what we find is that we do get children even after coming to us, even after the visual maturity is over. And so as Dr. Manjula just said, yes, we could do patching therapy. But, you know, to do in severe amblyopia, then again to do patching therapy. So are there any more modalities for treatment? Like, of course, there are a lot of literature on the computer vision training exercises. But is there any drug treatment? Because parents ask us if we can do any drug treatment. So Dr. Prachi has done an extensive study. In fact, she has published it in IJO in 2014 about citicoline treatment for citicoline in the treatment of amblyopia. Dr. Prachi Pawar has done a Peace Fellowship from Arvind Eye Hospital, and also her fellowship in pediatric ophthalmology from Harvard, USA in 2006, and Robert Peterson Fellowship at Children's Eye Hospital, Boston. She will be speaking on citicoline in the treatment of amblyopia. She runs her own super specialty 3 hospitals, the Mani Shankar hospitals at Nasik. Over to you, Dr. Prachi.
Thank you, Dr. Suma and the team for giving me this opportunity. Today I am going to talk on citicoline in the treatment of amblyopia. At the outset, I would like to thank my teachers. Yes, definitely the Temple of Ophthalmology in India, Arvind Eye Hospital, Dr. Kalpana Narendran and Dr. David Hunter, Dr. Robert Peterson for all the knowledge that they have imparted. Well, when we say something about amblyopia, the first thing that we do is the spectacle correction after the cycloplegic refraction and start them on patching. The children who don't have refractive error, we start them on patching as well. With amblyopia, definitely, for improving the vision. All the modalities, the conventional, the patching, or all the other modalities where we use, we all aim is to stimulate the visual process to enhance the activities going on in the optical tract. Here is the point, or here is a small attraction that I'm carrying. Everybody want your attention here, that everybody needs to give a small thought here to know or to think whether the optic tract is going to be structurally normal. Is there any lacunas in the developmental process as the birth history? So we need to think that whether the structure of each and every cell in the nerve fiber, the neuronal cells which are normal or no, whether there are the chemical composition inside and outside extracellular is normal or no. And here is the basic role where citicoline drug plays an important role as per my observations. Let us know about what is citicoline first. The mechanism of action of citicoline is like, it is an endogenous compound which is essential intermediate in the synthesis of cell membrane phospholipids, and its formation is this rate limiting step of phosphatidylcholine synthesis. It plays several important roles in human physiology, including enhancement of structural integrity and signaling for cell membranes. It supports the acetylcholine synthesis of betaine and methyl donor. Well, when citicoline is given, it provides the brain with the source of choline and cytidine, which are efficiently used in the Kennedy cycle to generate phospholipids. Citicoline also increases phosphatidylcholine synthesis. By the mechanisms for this may be by converting 1 or 2 glycerol into phosphatidylcholine. It also stimulates the synthesis of SAMe, S-adenosyl methionine, which aids in membrane stabilization and reduces the levels of arachidonic acid. This is especially important after an ischemia when arachidonic acid levels are elevated. While it also stimulates glutathione synthesis, and the activity of glutathione reductase is of importance. Here is the flow chart where when citicoline is given, it gives the brain cytidine and choline, and phospholipid is formed. This phospholipid is formed through 1 and 2 dicycloglycerol and through the other pathway of betaine, S-adenosyl methionine, where this plays an important role in the membrane integrity, and whereas it also enhances the synthesis of glutathione. Now, citicoline also shows its effect, which may also be explained by the reduction of phospholipase A2 activity, and it is able to attenuate the production of free radicals in ischemic conditions. So this is a pictorial presentation where you see that the phospholipase A2 activity and the free radicals which are released, which are the ROS, which are in the star red color, these two activities, when they are increased, they cause the neuronal cell death. So citicoline inhibits their activities and conserves the cell structure. Citicoline also influences the level of different neurotransmitters. It has been shown to increase acetylcholine, norepinephrine, dopamine level in the central nervous system, where we all know how important are the neurotransmitters at the presynaptic and the postsynaptic terminal for enhancing the transmission of visual process. Now, when we talk about citicoline, I guess many of you all must have some apprehensions about its side effects, but believe me, after experiencing, hardly any side effects are there, but what they are noted are GI disturbances, particularly some specific allergic to that particular drug. Low BP in adults is seen. Then there is a caution use it which is guarded in pregnancy and lactation, and as well as epilepsy. So what would be the dose that we should be using in children's when we are giving this patching therapy? Before that, I would like to highlight some few reference examples that how citicoline is widely used in different range by all the neurologists. It's like 1000 to 2000 milligram for the declining in thinking skills due to age. 600 milligram of citicoline per day can be used in chronic cerebrovascular disease or the ongoing blood vessel disease. 500 to 2000 milligram of citicoline per day is started within 24 hours of stroke in ischemic conditions. Where now, after knowing all this, what is the maximum or the dose that we can give in children or for amblyopic patients is 50 milligram per kg, which can be divided twice a day. Now children, the study that we carried out, we divided the group as younger and older, below 5 years and above 5 years. And the average weight was calculated like below 20 years and above 20 years. So we gave 250 milligram twice a day below 5-year children and 500 milligram twice a day for more than 5-year-old children. So when we have studied the 165 cases, we put them on a randomized control trial, and open study was carried out, wherein after inclusion criteria, we included 134 cases, which we put them into group 1 and group 2. Now both the cases, we started them on patching, and which were continued for couple of months, 7 to 8 months. And averagely 7 to 8 months, we found there is a plateau in both the groups, which was just plus minus 1 month here and there in both the groups. But we just continued patching in group 2 for all the 12 months duration after the plateau. And we put the group 1 patients with citicoline as per their age, the dosage was given. So initial 5 months, we did not find any improvement. So citicoline was given for initial 4 months, there was no improvement, but there was hardly any improvement. The significant improvement was noticed at the month of 5th month. And at the end of 12 months, we saw that 1.5 lines of improvement was there averagely. Whereas there was a little bit of an improvement or no improvement was seen in the patching group. And instead, for the long patching that we gave for 12 months, we saw a mild drop of vision in few cases, which was not very significant, but yes, there was a little drop in the vision. By the end of this, we followed in 12 months after citicoline was started, we followed 85 cases which were completed our follow-up of 12 months, and that were included in this study. This is a graphical presentation where the blue line represents the group 1, wherein citicoline was added at this plateau level. The red line is only patching was given to this group. And after the plateau, during the plateau level, when citicoline was added, you see that there is an increase in the vision. This is a logMAR axis, which identifies the 0 logMAR, 0.1 logMAR, that is 0 is 6 of Snellen's. So we reached up to, at the end of 12 months from citicoline, where we started, phase 2 started, and then we saw that we have reached up to 6.9 partial or so, which is 0.2, between 0.2 and 0.3 logMAR. And that was a significant improvement. The highlights of this, to make some few highlights, that the side effects, we didn't have any major side effects which were noted, except for one case which had vomiting, but there were added other factors, environmental factors, which were noted in that case. There are few limitations of this study, that it was not a double blind study, rather it was an open study. So observer or investigator bias may have been present. Second, we have analyzed only those subjects whose follow-up data was available up to 1 year in phase 2. Therefore, there was a problem of attrition which may have affected the result. No imputation method have been used to fill the missing values. Nevertheless, this study has shown that the addition of citicoline to patching therapy can significantly improve the visual acuity in amblyopic patients. When after the experience of using citicoline in number of cases, even after the study which I continued to, there were some few special cases which I would like to share. One of the case which was in strabismic amblyopic case, which we put them on patching, it didn't show any improvement, so a squint surgery was underwent. Then again patching was continued, but still no improvement was there, and then we added citicoline to it, and within few months we saw a dramatic improvement from 636 to 69, which was noted. And that was a very surprisingly, which was beyond the maturity age of the visual maturity age of the patient. I would rather specify that citicoline is very safely and very well used by me during the weaning of the patching therapy, because what the observation is that the drug, it plays an important role in maintaining the visual status at what all weaning we have decided from there onwards. To conclude, citicoline is safe to use. It adds to the value by improving the structural defects and maintains the cell integrity by chemical balance in and around the neural cells. Hence, can be used as an adjuvant treatment modality along with the other like patching or other visual stimulating exercises. To conclude, I would like to thank everybody and all the silent listeners. If you have any apprehension, one of my last suggestion would be that you should consult your neurologist who is there, who is practicing. The neurophysicians use it so widely is that they would rather assure you the safety, and you would come over the apprehension of starting use of citicoline in children. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Prachi, for a wonderful presentation. There are questions to you. I will just ask some questions before Dr. Manjula can share her screen. Any deterioration in visual acuity after discontinuing citicoline?
Yeah, no, I have not seen any deterioration in visual acuity after discontinuing citicoline.
So for how long do you give it? Like you give it for, so you have already just 1 year?
Yes, 1 year.
1 year. Which age group mainly? Because I mean, what I did in your study, you have said that there was no improvement after patching. Only those children with citicoline and with patching improved. Or
yeah, it is around the visual maturity age that we started this when we got in plateau. So
okay.
Once the plateau was acquired, so we knew that with patching we are not having any improvement. So we put them on citicoline. Rather, we can even administer or we can even start patching, citicoline along with patching up at a little early age, just before visual maturity is getting complete. So that can have a good effect on the integrity of the neural cells.
So they're asking you till what age you have tried citicoline, and what was the age group in your cases?
I have tried up to even 15 years of age that I have tried. The lowest age group that I started is around 4 to 4.5.
Okay, so you found the safety where there was no any other problems when you administered in younger children. I know the dose is less, but you didn't find any like severe gastritis or...
I found little difficulty in administrating the tablet because we had ample availability of tablet, but there is an availability. One of the company is giving syrup of citicoline, so that is also readily available.
Okay.
And so we just have to adjust the dose, like maybe 1 spoon may not be enough as per the body weight. So we just have to adjust the dose for the citicoline syrup below like 3 years or so.
Okay. So your youngest group is 4 years of age. Yeah. What about the progression of vision in citicoline? That you have already said in your presentation that you found 1.1 to 1.2 line improvement. anything you want to add, because they're asking you the progression of vision.
Progression of vision is 1.5 lines. That is, we did not reach up to 6.6, but we reached up to 6.9 partial. So at the end of 12 months, we have reached up to 6.9 partial, and the study, I mean, the patients were carried out further about 12 months of interval. So I have not reached, or rather only a few cases, I have reached up to 6.6. Not all the cases have reached up to 6.6. So there is I also felt during the study that probably the citicoline could be given at a little earlier age, where we have administered only after the plateau has come. So we gave conventional patching as the main important thing, and that is how citicoline was given only after the plateau was achieved.
Dr. Prachi, can you stop your share and Dr. Manjula can share her screen? Yeah.
Yes, sure.
Have you had any time to give your citicoline more than 1 year?
Citicoline more, yes, definitely. If there is improvement, which
Dr. Manjula, you can share your screen.
Yeah.
If the patient is showing the improvement, I continued the citicoline beyond 1 year also, because this was only after the experience shared by the neurophysicians that we gave it for years together, and it's pretty safe. So this was an accidental finding that I started with citicoline when I had one traumatic patient who had loss of vision, partial loss of vision due to trauma, and everything was done within the first 8 days by all the medical treatment of giving Solumetrol and all, and then he put them on citicoline, the neurophysician, which I was also following this case closely, and he really improved to a certain extent with citicoline. With the contrast sensitivity was also very good in that patient. So that was what the result convinced me to go forward with the study.
Okay, Dr. Prachi, you can answer the questions in the chat box. There are many questions for you.
Yeah.
I think you'll have to answer those questions in the chat box. So I think we'll go to the next speaker. We all know that computer exercises are now the new added treatment for, especially for amblyopia therapy already in the children who have already undergone patching, or who are non-compliant, or who are refractory to amblyopia treatment. So we need to go for the therapy. So Dr. Manjula, she will be speaking on monoocular fixation in binocular field therapy. So this is with the amblyopia iNet software. So Dr. Manjula Jayakumar is the alumnus of Shankar Nethralaya, Chennai, and has over 25 years experience in pediatric ophthalmology. She is a senior consultant and in charge of pediatric ophthalmology services at Dr. Agarwal Eye Hospital, Chennai. She is also the receiver of the Harbinger Award for the best pediatric practice in Vasan Eye Care. I would now ask her to speak on her topic. Dr. Manjula, over to you.
Thank you, Suma, for the introduction. Good evening, all. I'll be talking on monocular fixation in binocular field as a modality of treatment for amblyopia. Amblyopia iNet software uses this concept in amblyopia therapy. At the outset, I would like to tell you that I do not have any financial interest on this particular software. I'll be more talking on the concept of MFBF in amblyopia therapy. We all of us know about the monoocular modality of giving amblyopia therapy, that is patching. ATS-2A and ATS-2B have reduced the number of hours of patching, 2 hours per day in moderate amblyopia and 6 hours per day in severe amblyopia. But patching does come with its own drawbacks. There are issues in compliance with patching. Why? Because young children, they do not find any sense in occluding the better eye. Children of all ages are concerned about their appearance. Children are adept at beating the system. And despite compliance, despite very good compliance, you can still have failure to treatment. This failure happens in about 1/3 of cases, and the causes for the failure to treatment is older age at presentation, initial poor visual acuity, and the presence of significant astigmatism along with the spherical refractive error. So apart from monocular methods of amblyopia therapy, we also have binocular methods. But before coming to that, I will talk about the dose response that we have for patching. The dose response is about 0.1 log unit for 120 hours of occlusion therapy, and the treatment efficacy is 3 to 4 log lines. So patching actually gives very good visual results. At the end of patching therapy, you can get about 3 to 4 logmer lines of visual improvement, but the issue is compliance. We all have faced with problems when we give patching therapy to our children. So next came the binocular method. The binocular method can be divided into two types. One is perceptual learning, the other is dichoptic. So what is perceptual learning? In perceptual learning, you present an array stimulus to one or both eyes simultaneously. So repetitive stimulation with this array stimuli will cause an improvement in visual acuity. So a lot of visual tasks can be used in perceptual learning. They can be Gabor detection, vernier acuity, noise discrimination, position discrimination in noise, letter identification in noise, and contrast sensitivity. Any of these visual tasks can be used in perceptual learning. But there are drawbacks even with perceptual learning. It is better understood by adults than children. Children find it difficult to do it. And the amount of visual acuity improvement that you get in office is not translated into real life. So the next modality of treatment with binocular mode is dichoptic. In dichoptic, you present two independent stimuli to both the eyes. So the non-dominant eye is presented with a higher contrast stimuli. The dominant eye is present with a lower contrast stimuli. So since this is a binocular therapy, you have the integration of both stimuli happening, and therefore there is improvement in binocular vision with stereopsis. Now the advantage of binocular therapy is it is attractive to the child. You can use a virtual reality headset, you can use your iPad, you can use an interactive bit system. Whatever may be the modality, it appears attractive to the children initially phase, and the improvement in visual acuity is slightly better than perceptual learning. You get about 1.5 to 2 lines of acuity improvement. But despite its attractiveness, you find that less than only 1/4 of children will prescribe about 75% of the treatment. So this is what literature says. And all the studies that have been published have been for very short term. They have given this dichoptic therapy anywhere between 2 to 8 weeks. So we don't have a long follow-up. We don't know what is the long-term implication after stopping the dichoptic therapy. So next comes the MFBF therapy. So what is MFBF? It's a combination of both monocular and binocular. Does it sound confusing? It is monoocular fixation in a binocular field. So the work is done monocularly, but both eyes are kept open, or both eyes are kept in a binocular field. So basically the eye that is stimulated will view the target, and the dominant eye or the non-stimulated eye will view the background. So this is how MFBF works. Before going on to MFBF, I would like to look at amblyopia itself. Amblyopia, the eye which is amblyopic, is a developmentally disabled eye. So if you have to improve this developmentally disabled eye, you have to aid in the visual processing. So how will you aid in the visual processing? You have to give vision training to this particular eye. So this vision training is grossly termed as perceptual learning. So the visual training includes central or foveal fixation with hiding a brush or MIT. You have to improve accommodation. You have to get oculomotor precision with small detail. You have to reduce the crowding phenomenon, and you have to improve the spatial localization. So these are the fundamental basis of training the amblyopic eye. So in monoocular fixation in binocular field, it is like an analogy to picture in TV screen. The amblyopic eye will function centrally, while the normally preferred eye will function peripherally. So let us see what are the real life situation, how you can implement this MFBF. It can be implemented by two ways. One is the unsupervised or passive learning. In unsupervised or passive learning, you can use the occlusion foil which will decrease the vision of the good eye below the amblyopic eye, or you can use atropine. Atropine is also a form of MFDF because the eye which is atropinized, there'll be blur of vision, there'll be reduced depth in focus, and there will be aberration. So this particular atropinized eye will function below that of the amblyopic eye. So these are two conditions which are passive modes of delivering MFDF. Then let's go for the supervised or more active mode of delivering MFDF, which is called as perceptual learning, supervised perceptual learning. You can use anaglyphic glasses or polarized filter, and you can control the part of the stimulus that is seen by the amblyopic eye. There will also be a feedback mechanism present. So whenever the suppressed or the amblyopic eye is not focusing properly, basically there will be a feedback mechanism which will help it to do better. So let's go on to see how it functions. Now you can see the child is wearing red-green anaglyphic glasses. You have the letters printed in red. So the letters printed in red ink is seen by the amblyopic eye through the green filter. The non-amblyopic eye, the child actually traces the alphabets A, B, C with his pen. So the non-amblyopic eye or the dominant eye sees only where guided by the amblyopic eye. So this is the beauty of MFDF treatment. The eye which is stimulated sees the target. The dominant eye is going to be guided by the amblyopic eye, which is not relevant or which is not possible in the monocular method of amblyopia therapy, nor in the binocular method of amblyopia therapy. So this MFDF principle is incorporated in a lot of software, and the common thing which we are using now is the amblyopia iNet software delivered by the Home Therapy Solutions. As I told, I do not have any financial interest. I'm basically talking on the concept of this therapy. So this amblyopia iNet program can be delivered by both monocular methods as well as a binocular method using the red-green anaglyphic glasses. The binocular method or the MFDF method is what we have used in our hospital. So the child is not patched. The child will be using red-green anaglyphic glasses. The eye with the red filter will see the target. The green filter eye will see the background and the cursor. So you have a number of exercises. On a particular day, the child will play any of the 6 exercises given in this entire program. So each day the child can keep changing the exercises, and each exercise will last for 5 minutes. So the maximum time that a child will be employed or will be made to do the exercise will be only half an hour per day. Okay. So let us look at one particular exercise like the find the target. So this is the target which the child will have to visualize, and he has to capture all the targets of this particular shape. So the child will go keep finding the targets in the exercise, and there will be the number that has to be found out will be specified on the right top end. So it's easier for the child to do and can be done with less of parental supervision as opposed to other forms of therapy. So what happens is this has an online monitoring system also. So the doctor in the clinic or the optometrist in the clinic can have a tab of this exercise therapy, both in terms of performance as well as compliance. So as the child keeps getting better and better with the exercises, the size of the target keeps decreasing. So when you do this exercise, you're employing all the bases of therapy of vision training. What are the bases? I've already told you. That includes accommodative stimulation, reducing crowding, improving spatial localization, oculomotor control with fine detail, and also improving central fixation or foveal fixation. So all these modalities are going to get improved by MFDF therapy. So this is a good form of visual training exercise that can be employed. So we did a study, how good is this therapy really? Let's go on to an impartial IRB approved study, which was done at Dr. Agarwal's Chennai Main Hospital. It was a prospective study, but it was a small subset of patients, so it's a pilot study. So we include only anisometropic amblyopia, children in the age group of 4 to 15 years. 54 children were enrolled in the study, 24 were there in the patching group, and 30 were in the AmbiNet group. So all the children in the patching group did not have any prior history of treatment. So they were first-time amblyopes, whereas the children in the AmbiNet group, some of them opted to go for AmbiNet, so they were first-time amblyopes. Some of them were not compliant with patching. They had just done a few days in a month. So they, the parents came back and said, no, my child is not cooperative with patching. So the demarcation that we took is less than 50% of the prescribed hours of patching. So these two arms of treatment were analyzed every month, first month of therapy, third month of therapy, and 6 months of therapy. So basically visual acuity was looked into, and we found that the visual gain in the AmbiNet group was 0.54 logMAR as opposed to the patching. Though the visual gain was looking better in the AmbiNet group, this was not statistically significant, but clinically, yes. The children who underwent AmbiNet had a 5-line improvement as opposed to a 3.5-line improvement in patching group. That's the number 1 point. And then we divided into subsets of older age group versus younger age group. The younger age group was 4 to 8 years. The older age group was 9 to 15 years. So the younger age group children as well as the older age group children did almost equally well both in AmbiNet and patching. We did not find any statistically significant. There could be a little clinical significant differences, but statistically no significance between the two age groups. The stereopsis present versus stereopsis absent group. The stereopsis present group, if you see, the patching, this was a little unusual kind, because though patching is just a monocular method of delivering amblyopia therapy, the patching group had a double in visual acuity improvement as compared to the AmbiNet in the stereopsis present. We cannot explain with this finding, but this is what we got. The stereopsis absent, both groups had almost the same amount of visual acuity improvement. As far as hyperopia and myopia, we did not find any difference between patching and AmbiNet, and there was no statistical significance. And the pattern of visual improvement, the patching group, there were 24 children, and it became the ones who ended up in the mild impairment group were 21, as opposed to 12 where we started off. And in the AmbiNet, that is 21 children improved out of 24, and AmbiNet 25 versus 30. We did have few cases of recidivism in patching, which was not found in AmbiNet. Okay, so if almost both are going to give equal amounts of visual gain or non-statistical improvement in visual gain, so why should we go for an MFDF therapy? Yes, there are certain advantages. There are only 10 hours of exercise is required in month in AmbiNet versus 60 to 80 hours, which you would see in patching. So the social stigma, the peer pressure, the psychological trauma, everything comes down when you go for a therapy like this, where both eyes are kept open and the number of hours are reduced. It's more engaging. The intense sustenance is better. Compliance is 85% in the AmbiNet group versus 75% in patching. So compliance was an edge better. Less of parental supervision is needed. We did have online monitoring systems, equivalent visual gains, and the great advantage is you had long-term follow-up of all these patients, which dichoptic therapy never brought about. So we have seen these patients for a period of 6 months. There was not much of recidivism. There were equivalent visual gains and much easier method of administering a therapy in a child. So this is the end of my presentation. As far as amblyopia therapy is concerned, it is like putting in pieces of a jigsaw puzzle. If you put in all your pieces correctly, the picture becomes perfect. Thank you for your patient hearing, and thanks, Dr. Suma, for giving me this opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Bhansali. It was an excellent presentation. We'll take in questions a little bit later because we will take both the therapies together, the dichoptic therapy by Mr. Mohammad Oliola, and then we can take both the questions, because then we can debate monocular therapy is better or dioptic therapy is better, and what are the gains, advantages of monocular, and what are the advantages of dioptic therapy. And so I would request you to stop the share, and please please send in questions so that we can ask Dr. Manjula, and she can also reply some on the chat box. So I would now request Mr. Mohammad Olula Abdul, who is the founder director of Binox Vision Therapy Software, to speak on dioptic management of amblyopia. So now we heard, of course, the iNet has both the monocular and the dioptic therapy. In fact, in Shroff, we only have the monocular element, and now with Binox, we have started the dioptic therapy too. So he'll be telling us about the dioptic management of amblyopia. He is the founder director of Binox Vision Therapy Software. He did his optometry fellowship research training at LVP. He has, apart from his clinical work, engaged himself in innovation and research on binocular vision disorders. So I would now ask him to speak on the dioptic management. We will take in questions and we can debate at the end on both the therapies. So Dr. Manjula, please be ready for more questions. And over to you.
Good evening, all of you. Thank you, Dr. Suma, for this opportunity. And Dr. Manjula made my presentation very simple because she already explained all the scope of binocular management, how it can be more effective, or that we'll be debating on, but how it can be more convenient compared to the patching. So when you talk about dioptic management, today we'll understand what are the amblyogenic defects in the visual system, a very overview. Dr. Prachi already explained on this. And then what are the expected outcomes in dioptic management, or which patients or subset of patient is going to be benefited most from this dioptic therapy. So as Dr. Sobita already mentioned about different kind of ATS studies. So just to summarize the drawbacks that ATS studies has. So it pointed out the residual amblyopia in ATS 2A, and then poor compliance, as many of you already explained, in both motors and rotor studies, as along with the ATS study. The other crucial factor is the slow improvement, as Dr. Manjula spoke about 10 hours versus probably 80 to 180 hours. And then recurrence is one of the major aspect in this group of amblyopia management, especially in the patching or atropine penalization. And coming to the deficit in stropsis, that portion is not clearly mentioned in any of the ATS studies based on the patching. And if you go to older adults for the first time, yes, there are certain improvements to a limited efficacy, but most of the cases it is ineffective. So being so many drawbacks into the patching, though it's a gold standard till this point of treatment. So here the neurophysiology says in amblyopia, it is the functional issues in the visual system that limits the visual maturation and the improvement of vision. So as we can see that amblyopia primarily disorder in the 4th and 5th order neurons, which is in lateral geniculate body and the visual cortex, and not into the eye level. So what happens exactly in lateral geniculate body? So if there is an early deprivation kind of amblyopia, so that affects the lateral geniculate body cells and becomes pale and shrunken. And that leads to the amblyogenic factors, and one pathway from the open eye, which is the dominant eye, took over the territory of the closed eye. And whereas in cases of visual cortex is little different in Brodmann area 17 and 4C. So this is predominantly for the ocular dominance column. So expansion of the dominant eye happens, and this results in the density or quality of the depth of amblyopia, which results into. Now, once this functional development or neurophysiology we understand from this concept, now we understand this binocular concept, as the binocular neurons are active throughout our life. So this dioptic kind of amblyopia management we have introduced, and there are many more programs in what happened, dominant eye received a image of a lesser contrast, as again Dr. Manjula nicely explained. The moment there is a decrease in contrast, then the brain processes binocular images by reducing the inhibitory interaction in the ocular dominance column, and thus it results in binocular activities. Now, when you get multiple games based on this dichoptic principle, so it makes more compliant and more interactive for the child or even adults. And if you have a scoring system which gives a little bit incentive for the child by playing more and more activities, that gives more engagement to the program and results in better efficacy. So this program of different amblyopia activities based on dichoptic is giving enormous results. And we are not stopping at that just concept of dichoptic. We are also looking at how to improvise their fusion and stereopsis by the same treatment protocol or management protocol by dichoptic therapies. Now, a standard management protocol, what we follow in dichoptic is 1 hour is standard by even pediatric eye disease investigator group is following the same protocol, 1 hour per day, at least 5 days in a week, and for 6 weeks. The first 10 session, what we work on the anti-suppression activities. So if there are suppression, severe ambulance, work on the anti-suppression activity, you work on the flat fusion, and then at last 10 session, you work on their stereopsis development. And we found out even many of the places, so these are data I'll be presenting from 3 eye centers from India. So we got 150 total anisometropic patient. Again, this was given in 3 of the centers. So we have divided into 3 components. So anisometropic in right eye, 56 patient of median age of 9 years showed almost 4 lines logMAR line improvement in 6 weeks. Then in the left eye, it shows again around 4 lines. So there was no inter eye difference between right and left eye. But what happened in cases of isometropic amblyopia, so again, you get a similar kind of improvement, and there was no inter eye difference between right and left eye, even in this group. So as the outcome, which is not only the visual acuity, especially in binocular therapies or dichoptic therapies, what we observe interestingly that all anisometropic amblyopes almost, so in cases of right eye, it was 90%. So 50 out of 50, 45 gained stereopsis, even though there was a strong suppression at the initial level of the management program. And in cases of left eye, it improved in 42 cases out of 53. So 80% of gain their visual stereopsis from an absent state. And in case of isometropic, all of them gained their stereo acuity. So this was the major outcome which came from this group, apart from the visual acuity that has improved. And this is a little different from what Dr. Manjula's observation, as dichoptic group or MAPF group did not show any kind of significant stereopsis development. Sorry, I think someone shared the screen. Okay, I'm back to my presentation. Somebody disturbed in between. So if you see the outcome measures in cases of dichoptic therapies, so the measure or the advantages that we observed in any kind of dichoptic therapy, that the compliance is excellent. In our this perspective group, we got more than 95% patients who are adherent to the protocol because of interactive games. And the improvement was very fast, as we talked about 3 to 6 line improvement only in 6 weeks program. So that was second observation. And almost 90% of these subjects restored their binocular vision in terms of the stereopsis. And even in another cohort study, what we are doing, we have done more than 100 patients now, that it is also effective in older age group. And older as in, I'm talking about 18 to 59 is the age group that we worked upon, and that also has around 3.5 to 4 lines visual acuity improvement along with their binocular vision. And this is 3 years cohort data. I'm talking about the recurrence. There is no recurrence of all these patients who underwent this dichoptic therapy, not even a single line, especially in the logMAR acuity we talked about. We have used the ATTRS chart and there was no recurrence of amblyopia. Now, if you look at the outcome, in which cases the dichoptic therapy works best is whenever there is a proper motor alignment of the eye. So if you look at the strabismic amblyop, you need to correct them. So you need to align them better, and then only you can incorporate into the program. So straightforward, if it is of anisometropic amblyop or isometropic meridional amblyops, they're the best to yield the results in case of dichoptic therapies. And in cases of strabismic, you need to alter your management plan. Traditionally, you patch them, improve them, and then do the surgical intervention. Whereas if you are planning for a dichoptic management, you need to align their motor fusion, which is needs to be there even before enrolling for this dichoptic therapy. Now, if you have somebody with eccentric fixation, you need to rule them out. So those are the cases you are not going to get a good amount of improvement in dichoptic therapies. So bifoveal fixation, again, a good clinical indicator whether to enroll for dichoptic therapies or not. Now, if somebody having eccentric fixation, for those group of patients, we have another cohort where we observe that their near vision acuity improves significantly, but distance vision usually limited to 1.5 lines in the improvement of their binocular vision. And in terms of the binocular vision, they become monofixator, so we get good amount of flat fusion for near. Distance stereopsis still a major concern for patient with eccentric fixators. Now, so this coming to this program, we are very proud that one of this Make in India product that giving a very good amount of dichoptic outcome, and we are privileged to be one of the first mover into this field. And thank you, Dr. Suma, for giving me this opportunity, and we'll be sharing many more results in coming months. And I'm open for the question if you have anything.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mr. Oli, for a very wonderful presentation. Now, I would like to, there are a few questions in the chat box. So I mean, have you, Dr. Manjula, which cases do you choose for binocular dichoptic therapy or monocular therapy, or do you have any fixed criteria where you go for monocular or binocular dichoptic therapy?
The treatment that is first offered to parents is patching. But then when you call them, you know, after a month, some of them will say the difficulties they face with patching, that the child is not able to do patching, or child is doing very few of the prescribed hours. So one thing I would like to tell Suma, the MFBF therapy is not actually a dichoptic therapy.
Exactly, yes.
What I have been pointing out. It's different from dichoptic. MFBF is like you don't have a low contrast, a high contrast stimuli with integration of binocular function. It's not like that. It is one eye seeing the background, the other eye seeing the target. I've used the red-green anaglyphic filters with the red ink, which is also, you know, which was not a computerized form. You can do MFBF even by that mode. See, so it's just a different concept. It is, what do I say? It's a slide in between. It's in between the patching and it's in between the dichoptic therapy, the binocular therapies.
So we have also at Shroff done a study on the iNet, and we have found that because you have also done, you have used mainly cases of anisometropic amblyopia.
Only anisometropic.
Yeah. So we have done with strabismic and even with deprivational amblyopia, and we have found improvement of deprivational amblyopia. In fact, it was very surprising. We saw more lines improvement. Optometrist Prem has done a study, and he has found that there's more line improvement with maybe the visual acuity which you start with. And he has found more visual improvement, because in isometropic amblyopia, there is a 2 or 3 lines improvement, but more we got with deprivational amblyopia, which was surprising. So we have not published it because you have done a very nice study of
no, actually, Suma,
CT.
we have also used deprivation amblyopic children, but the number was small. The cohort
Yes,
was
exactly. Yeah, yeah.
So we have when I sent it for publication, it's in the process of publication. Maybe the next edition of Strabismus Journal is going to come out. So I didn't want those small numbers to be,
Exactly.
with the flow and of the investigation. So that's why we removed it. So we have some results, good results, better than patching. But
Yes.
whenever I see deprivation amblyopia, if I give half an hour of Ambinet, I also tell them to do the number of hours of patching as prescribed by the pedic. I don't leave it at only the Ambinet, because
so you don't do at all. Even that's what we also do. We do not advise only Ambinet. We advise along with patching therapy.
Anisometropic amblyopia, I give only Ambinet. I'm not going to give patching. These were cases which went only for Ambinet. There was no patching, the subset arm. So
and you found the improvement, yes.
The improvement.
So that is a good, so I think that is something which we can all take home, that if children who are non-compliant.
One value addition to this deprivational amblyopia, as we was talking about, it is mainly of lateral geniculate body which is affected. So dicoptic or any MFVF works best and yields much superior results, and you can end up in getting around
better results,
better results, yeah.
And that is same observation with us as well. So we have done with couple of child with congenital cataract, and they recovered fantastic improvement around 9 lines, logmal lines.
Exactly. Deprivation amblyopia, we found around 5 to 6 line improvement, and we got it much better. I mean, of course, the lines improvement was more than the anisometropic amblyopia, but that is a completely different. So now, which cases, like you were saying that, Mr. Oli, that you say that the motor alignment has to be perfect before we go in. Like sometimes when we do surgery and there's a residual small amount of micropropia. So do you recommend to do the exercises with prisms, or?
Yes.
How much should be the motor alignment, which you can do the dicoptic?
Alignment, I talk about that if there is a residual strabismus or overcorrection in case of surgical intervention or undercorrection. So if it is less than 10 or 12, we give prisms as a must and do the alignment first and start with the program. So what happens in dicoptic therapy, if you have misaligned eye, even if it is microtropic, then they will not able to follow or superimpose the image that comes from two eye, which is differentiated in contrast. So alignment of the motor component is very crucial in any dicoptic activities. So use prism in cases of residual or undercorrection or overcorrection in case of surgical intervention, and start doing this binocular activities.
Okay.
I would like to know
what about the cost factor? Sorry. Somebody is asking the cost factor for the treatment, the cycles, and I think Mr. Oli, can you, because there's a question for that, like how many cycles will you follow up and how long would you give, and the cost factor.
Correct. So if you see the standard management protocol that we are following is only for 6 weeks. 6 weeks as in you are giving 30 sessions, 5 sessions a week. And in 30 sessions, the average improvement you get 4 to 6 logmal line. And usually
how do you answer this?
Usually in moderate, mild to moderate amblyopia, you are through with the management protocol. And the cost is, if you look at the cumulative cost, as in the compare with the patching therapy, especially the time for the parents needs to devote for the follow-up and the multiple consultation. And if you see the 10 days or 30 days of program, which is like a combination of certain factor, if charge is different from North India to South India, from Eastern to Western region, but it is cumulative cost is much lesser than the amblyopia management through patching therapy.
Okay, there are a few more questions for Dr. Manjula and Mr. Oli. I think you can answer them in the chat box. Because I think we are running short of time. I would like to call Dr. Susan Jacob. Is she joined in? Uh, Share your screen, please.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yeah, but your screen is not shared, huh?
Okay, fine. Just give me a minute.
Okay, Dr. Susan Jacob will be teaching us or telling us about the next hot topic, which we all, there are parents asking us all the time, should we go for LASIK? Should we go for clear lens extraction? Because they have a lot of questions. So she is the director and chief of Refractive and Cornea Foundation and the senior consultant cataract and glaucoma services at Dr. Agarwal's group of eye hospitals, Chennai. She has 21 years of experience and has received many international awards, the JRS Waring Medal Award, the Kritzinger Memorial Award for ISRS, and also the chair of Multimedia Editorial Board, AO-ISRS. She has over 200 publications, and now she will be telling us, should we go in for LASIK surgery or refractive surgery for an isometropic amblyopia, and or should we not go for it?
Yeah, thank you
Dr. Susan.
So much, Dr. Suma, for having invited me here. Thanks to all the panelists on this on the screen right now. Thanks for inviting me, because I know I'm very different from all the others who are sitting here, who are hardcore strabismus and all about amblyopia. This is something that's completely, different for the rest of us ophthalmologists, I guess. And so I will stick to my field, which is basically refractive surgery in children. So my talk is about SMILE for pediatric refractive surgery, basically for myopic anisometropia, and I don't have any financial interest in this topic. It's going to be a short talk. Pediatric laser refractive surgery is approved by FDA only for people more than 18 years. And even here in India, this is what we generally do. In fact, we may even take it to a higher age limit of about 21 years and higher. And we always look for refractive stability. So that's one of the key things when you do a refractive surgery. The first thing that you ask the patient is, how long have you been wearing these glasses? Have your glasses been remaining stable? Is your power increasing? So refractive stability is of extreme importance in adults in laser refractive surgery. So, sorry, my slide's not moving. Yeah. So when is refractive surgery actually appropriate in children? The indications include bilateral high refractive error, and especially more important, unilateral severe anisometropia with amblyopia. So these are indications where conventionally refractive surgery has already been performed worldwide. Of course, not in all centers, but there are centers which are doing this. Children who cannot wear glasses or contact lenses, now that's another important category. For example, someone who's having limbal dermoids, contact lenses may not sit, and if you've got high anisometropia, the chances of amblyopia developing secondary to not being able to correct the anisometropia with, well enough with glasses and not being able to place contact lenses can become significant. Golden hour syndrome is another problem. Behavioral or developmental problems with the child where he may not be willing to wear the glasses, or even more difficult, the contact lenses. Facial deformities, prematurity, cerebral palsy, autism, all of these are examples where this kind of correction may be difficult. And as such, wearing high anisometropia where you might require contact lens treatment is difficult for some patients and parents. We see that parents coming and saying, the child does not wear contact lenses, very difficult, or he's not keeping his eyes and hands clean, he's rubbing his eyes. So considering the higher risk associated with contact lenses, there are lots of patients, and also the higher care required, patients and parents who do not like the idea of wearing contact lenses. And of course, there is increased risk in some situations, such as socioeconomic status and so on and so forth, behavior abnormalities. You need to do something for these children to avoid visual isolation and social isolation in such children, because wearing very thick, high, heavy glasses, you normally see these children a little more introvertish, little more not really mixing with their friends and peers as much, silent children who like to remain isolated with themselves. And this is what you want to avoid in a child. You want to be able to give them full the benefit of full social development and visual development, both of which is important, as well as psychological improvement for them. And generally you see that once you can do this either with contact lenses or with refractive surgery, the child is not isolated, he becomes more alert and involved. But of course, the problem with contact lenses, I already mentioned, there are so many problems and so many situations where contact lenses may not be ideal. And also it's not a full-time treatment. You know, you can wear them for 8 hours a day and not more than that, and beyond that you increase the risk to the cornea. So it's a part-time treatment even when successful. Now, what are the problems when you consider refractive surgery in children? One of them is that it's a growing eye, it's still growing. So that's a real problem because you have a changing refractive status. Preoperative assessment for these children is difficult. Surgery as such is difficult. You have a difficult post-operative assessment because you may not be able to see them well on slit lamp. They may not be able to cooperate well enough for visual acuity assessment and so on and so forth. And of course, you have a higher risk of complications such as induced aberrations and many other complications such as flap-related complications and so on. Now, when you look at anisometropia as a subset, we know that it has a much higher risk of amblyopia. And also these children have less motivation to wear glasses because they're basically seeing well. They're seeing well with the other eye. The other eye is even if they have to wear glasses for the other eye, they see perfectly well. They don't have any problems, and therefore what happens is that they're not fully motivated to wear contact lenses for the other eye. And the other problem that can happen when you do refractive surgery is that the child can become myopic again with the growth of the eye. But taking all these into consideration, even then, there are advantages of refractive surgery in indicated children, and I'll specify and stress upon that word indicated children again. This is not for all children, but just for indicated cases. And basically, it gives these children, it decreases the chances for amblyopia developing in these children. It gives them a better chance of binocularity. You get a full-time correction of refractive error, and you're no longer dependent on compliance of the patient, which is a big boon for both patients and parents. You don't have any dangers of contact lens wears, and this, of course, this can vary from country to country, vary from socioeconomic status, vary depending on the culture, and so on and so forth. So not everybody is comfortable with contact lens wear, and not in all situations may it be safe either. You, of course, have to follow up these children with glasses for the residual refractive error, and for emerging new refractive errors, you will have to do occlusion therapy, and you have to have close follow-up for these patients. So considering all of these, you have to have a very good informed consent and a good talk with the patients and with the parents, informing them the reason why you're doing refractive surgery, that it's not to get rid of this power totally, but to bring it into a balance with the other eye, or if the other eye is plano, then bring it to that status. But also informing them at the same time that this may not remain as such, and with the growth of the eye, he will still develop, or he or she, the child will still develop, may still develop new refractive errors. And also that the minute you do the refractive surgery, the vision is not going to improve. You do still need to follow up a lot with occlusion therapy and so on and so forth. So as far as preoperative assessment is concerned, again, you have problems. The older children may be cooperative for preoperative assessment, but younger children may not be. So in uncooperative patients, you may have to do part of your preoperative assessment under general anesthesia. And we know that, refractive amblyopia, one of the advantages is that even older children can improve and respond to occlusion. So this is again another really a very big reason why you should go in for refractive surgery in, again, indicated cases alone. What are the surgical challenges that you face during surgery? One is that you need a GA machine. The second is that fixation by the child may not be possible. And I use the word may because it's not necessary that all of these children are very young. We do them sometimes in older children. And in India especially, I find that a child who's maybe more than 9 to 10 years old is generally reasonably cooperative for surgery, especially if you've talked to them before surgery and explained to them, and especially if it's SMILE, because SMILE is much more gentle on the eye. Now, surgeon centration is what is required, because now if the child is uncooperative, then you might need to do surgeon centration. Decentered ablation is possible, so you have to take care about that. The aim is plano while avoiding anisometropia. I'll come to that later. Post-operative steroids may be required more intensively and for longer periods, and a myopic shift with growth is expected, so you need to be prepared for that. So when you look at the development of the eye, we know that at birth, the cornea has about 51 diopters of power, and it's about 10 millimeters in diameter. And by 2 years of age, it's decreased down to 42 to 44 diopters of power, which is the adult range, and 12 millimeters of diameter. Similarly, the lens, which is at birth 34 diopters, decreases down to about 28 diopters by 6 months, and then it continues to grow. And the axial length changes from about 17 millimeters. And by about 2 years, it reaches about 95% of the adult axial length. So more than 2 years, you don't basically do surgery under 2 years at all. You have to wait for 2 years. Until then time, you might have to depend on other kind of ways to correct the anisometropia. But in smaller, really small children, the mother might actually find it easier to put a contact lens than in slightly older children. So generally wait for 2 years. That's a good idea, definitely. Because of what we just discussed, huge changes in refractive errors in the first 2 years. And the other thing is also that the cornea in these pediatric children is softer. The sclera is also softer. So your suction may be unreliable even if you're doing a LASIK. Microkeratome cuts will be unreliable, especially if you're doing a LASIK. Pachymetric measurements have to be taken at multiple locations all over the cornea. That's important because you may not get a good pentacam or an OPSCAN preoperatively. You can do a handheld topography under an EUA or under GA. Now, there has been a report where William Assel has performed LASIK as early as 10 months. So that's an option. But we do not do this in our practice. What are the advantages? Now, when you consider LASIK, now we just consider the different forms of refractive correction in children. If you can look at LASIK, the advantages are that it's very effective, it's got this wow factor, it's very popular in adults, it has little pain. But when you come to children, it's a completely different ball game because of the flap that's there. So you can have flap related complications intraoperatively, again because of the small soft eye, because of the uncooperative patient, sudden movements, smaller eye as such, a smaller palpable aperture. There's so many reasons where this can cause problem. And also you can have post-operative flap related complications because a child may rub the eye, may not be as careful as otherwise in an adult. It's also difficult to examine the flap post-operatively, so you can have striae and other problems when you do LASIK. The other main problems in LASIK is that when you give general anesthesia gases, these can affect the LASIK settings and the outcomes, which means that any change in the atmosphere in the LASIK theater can affect the outcomes of that the machine gives. And so that's a big problem. And also if you're doing femto LASIK, you'll have to shift between two machines. That's again another problem. Now, coming to surface ablation of PRK, the advantage is that it is safe. There's no risk of flap rubbing. Children do heal rapidly. And the problem of examining for the flap status post-operatively is no longer there, even if the child is uncooperative. But the disadvantage is again that the GA gases can affect the excimer laser settings and the outcomes. Therefore, it's more painful for the child, and therefore the child may rub his eyes. It's going to be more uncomfortable for the child post-operatively. And the most important thing is that when you do higher corrections, you might need to put mitomycin C, and you can still have the problems of delayed recovery. Risk of haze and regression is higher following following PRK, and you might have scarring also because of an exuberant inflammatory response in children, or a healing response in children rather. So you will have to give longer and more intensive steroids, and you'll also have to do frequent IOP checks. What about refractive lens exchange and phakic IOL? Of course, these are obviously not preferred in children. Refractive lens exchange has a high chance of retinal detachment, especially in high myopes. You have a softer eye, and every time you go in for any intraocular surgery in softer eyes, you do predispose to posterior segment complications. You can have simultaneously, you have to account for the higher inflammatory response in children. So these are things obviously that you'll not be thinking of much at all. Risk of glaucoma, loss of accommodation, again not very reliable. And even when you look at phakic IOLs, they have their own problems. Antechamber phakic IOLs, because of the smaller antechamber depth in children, is a problem. It can lead on to crowning, corneal and angle compromise, and of course uveitis as well. Even posterior chamber phakic IOLs are not very preferred in children because of secondary cataracts and an increased inflammatory response, and also because as the eye grows, the phakic IOL can rotate, and that can again cause problems with the effective power, especially if you have corrected astigmatism as well. So considering all these, now what about SMILE? What role does that play? SMILE is a very simple procedure. Basically, you have a femtosecond laser which cuts a lenticule within the cornea, and this lenticule corresponds to the refractive error that you're planning to correct. And then you remove this lenticule through a small incision. So essentially, it's a refractive surgery without a flap, and it gives you a cornea-based refractive surgery. The advantages the SMILE has is it's much more safer, especially it becomes an advantage in children where you don't have problems associated with flap related complications such as flap mobility, striae, epithelial ingrowths, flap dislodgement, and infections associated with rubbing because of a flap that's not placed properly, so on and so forth. And also you have a very gentle corneal suction that is applied with the SMILE machine, so that's again of help. It's a cap. So as I just mentioned, there's no risk of all these things which we just discussed. There's less chance of flap related complications, less chances of GA gases. So that's another big advantage, because the smile machine is purely, the smile procedure is purely femtosecond laser assisted. There's no excimer laser role at all. And therefore the GA gases do not have any influence on machine settings and outcomes. So there's no effect of environmental factors on this. You just have to maintain temperature. That's it. There's no shifting between the machines. It's not, it becomes much more comfortable when you're doing this, because the child under GA does not have to be shifted. Children heal rapidly. There's less dry eye. We know that as an advantage of smile, even in adults, better biomechanics, and also it's an extraocular procedure. The disadvantages at present is that it cannot treat hypermetropia. Currently, commercially, though, it's already being treated in studies. So you have the lenticule that's basically a donut-shaped lenticule, which is being used to treat hyperopia, but this is not yet commercially available. You can't treat higher order aberrations. There are no trackers for astigmatism presently. And the highest correction that you can go for currently is -10 sphere and -5 diopter cylinder. So here's an example of a child where we did smile. This was a 5-year-old child. In the right eye, the uncorrected vision was 636, improving with -2.5 and -1.5 cylinder to 6.9. And in the left eye, the uncorrected visual acuity was 660, and he took a -10 sphere and a -1.5 cylinder. At the axis was same in both eyes. You can see the cylinder was same in both eyes, but he improved only to 680. So now the aim was to correct only the left eye. Obviously, for the right eye, he would still go ahead with glasses. And also the aim was to correct only the sphere. So you can leave the cylinder alone in such patients, because first, it's a well-balanced cylinder. There's no anisometropia because of the cylinder. It's purely a spherical component that you have to take care of. And also your problems with smile as far as cylindrical correction is concerned are also not no longer relevant. So this was a surgical planning that we had taken, and here's a video of a pediatric smile. The same child that we just discussed. So what we did is we took a flap thickness of 120 microns, and this gave us a lenticular thickness of 156 microns and residual stromal thickness of about 310 microns. So as I said, the intended correction was 10 diopters. And here's the surgery. So you have to, if the child is under GA, as I said, you would have to do the centration. I'm sorry. You would have to do the centration. So you might have to hold the eye with forceps and center. If the child is reasonably cooperative, and sometimes they are, then you wouldn't have to do this. So you can see there's a little bit of a struggle there in applanating. And this is something you have to be careful about. So you might have to do a couple of attempts. You have to ask the anesthetist to give a proper sedation so the child does not move in the middle of surgery. And also you have to make sure that the child is held also as well, and also give her the proper anesthetic mix. So here you can see that was the centration, which is reasonably centered on the pupil. This is a lenticular cut that's being made. And then you have the lenticular side, which you're just seeing there. And then you have the cap cut, which is being made now, which is an anterior cut. The first is a posterior cut, then you have a lenticular side cut, then the anterior cut, and that final thing is a smile incision cut. So now once that's done, once the laser's passed, the rest of it is much more easier, because then you're not worried. Now the advantage of, one of the advantages that you have to think of also is that in case the child moves during surgery, what happens? Well, you can always reapplanate and continue with smile in all cases, unless you have gone more than 10% of the primary cut, in which case you can have the option of converting to LASIK. But in all the other situations, you can do a continue with the smile again, or you can just leave it alone and just abort the procedure. So that's a second option. So there's not a situation where you're stuck halfway. It's not as though you've done something and now you're not able to get out of it. There's always an option of aborting if you're not wanting to go ahead, if you're not happy with the laser pass that's happened. So that was the initial thing that you saw was the posterior cut that was made. And then following that, the initial thing you saw was the anterior cut that was made, and following that you dissect the posterior cut. There are signs that which we have published that I've described, and the white ring sign is something that we use to make sure that you have dissected the lenticule completely, and also the sequential segmental lenticular side cut dissection, which is again an article which I published in JCRS, both of them. And these help you to make sure that you've done full dissection of the lenticule and removed it. Generally, smile lenticule removal is not very difficult in children because you're doing this for anisometropia, so the power is probably a high refractive error. So the lenticules are likely to be thick, and so you generally do not have much issues with the lenticular dissection. So there you can see that's the size of the incision. It's a small incision, and basically that's it. That's basically it. There's no risk of anything moving. You can see there are no mobile flaps or anything like that. So this is a much more safer and more predictable post-operative outcome in this child as far as anatomy is concerned, without fears of problems happening. So this was the visual outcome for this patient. The left eye was preoperatively -10 with -1.5 at 180/618, and postoperatively, after occlusion therapy, he was down to -1, -1.5 at 160. He improved to 6.9, which was a very good correction. Here's the postoperative pentacam of the patient, and you can see we got a very well-centered ablation, not ablation, lenticular removal here, lenticular extraction here. You can see it's well-centered on the visual axis, and we've got a good outcome in that as well. So again, here's a pre-op of the patient and a post-op of the patient. And here's a post-op anti-segment OCT, again showing well-centered extraction of the lenticule. So in our series, we had 7 patients with a mean age of about 10 years, with a minimum of 5 and a maximum of 15 years. The right eye was operated in 2 and the left eye in 5 patients. All 7 had anisometropic amblyopia. Preoperatively, the mean uncorrected visual acuity was about 0.03 with a standard deviation of 0.02. This is in decimals, which is approximately equal to 6/240. And postoperatively, we got an uncorrected visual acuity of about 618. The best corrected visual acuity improved from preoperative of approximately 6/15, that's 0.41 in decimal equivalent, to about 6.9 postoperatively. Of course, this is not immediate post-op, this is post-occlusion therapy as well. And both of these were significant, as you can see. And the spherical equivalent decreased from 11.09 to about 2.16 postoperatively. So again, you can see what we are planning for in SMILE when you do these refractive anisometropic amblyopias is not to bring them down to plano, but bring them down to a place where you can balance them out with the other eye, and they're no longer having anisometropia. So pachymetry, we had a post-op pachymetry of about 395. We had a spherical equivalent difference, as you can see here, between the 2 eyes. So the spherical equivalent difference between the 2 eyes preoperatively was about 9.27 diopters. Post-operatively, we decreased the difference down to about 2.17 diopters, again statistically significant. And we had a flap thickness of about 112, mean lenticular thickness of 143, and residual stromal thickness of 270. So as far as planning tips are concerned, you do need to take multiple pachymetric measurements with different devices. So that's important. And you also have to take it over multiple areas of the cornea. It's better to always err to the safer side. You correct fully up to about 10 diopters unless the pachymetry doesn't allow it, or unless you end up having reverse anisometropia. So you balance it with the other eye. As far as astigmatism correction is concerned, it's more difficult to ascertain the axis under general anesthesia. So it's preferable to treat the sphere as far as possible, unless the cylinder is really, really significant. And if the cylinder is really significant, what you can do is overcorrect by about 10%. You can also mark the patient's eye preoperatively if the patient is cooperative enough, or using photographs that are taken with the patient looking straight ahead, and then correct the astigmatic axis using the cone, using the applanating cone. That's another way that you can do it to get a better axis correction. Informed consent is important, so you have to explain the goal to the parents so that they are on the same page as you are. And good GA is important with no movements of the child. So you have to remember that the child is not fixing, so you can have centration errors, you can have rotational errors. The eye should be facing upwards, that's important. The face should be positioned. These are all, tips for refractive surgeons. So the face has to be positioned so the applanating cone doesn't hit the nose. You should have no movement once the laser is activated. So as soon as the laser is activated, you have to, or rather as soon as the cone is docked, you have to inform the anesthetist that the next 30 seconds are very important. So it takes about 30 seconds for the SMILE lenticule to be cut. And those 30 seconds are crucial, and the anesthetist should be aware that at that point of time, there should be absolutely no movements at all. And also, you have to have no movements while dissecting, because no sudden movements while dissecting, because that can lead to cap tears. So to conclude, majority of the children with ametropia, unilateral or bilateral, do well with glasses or contact lenses, but a minority do not. And pediatric refractive surgery meets an important need for this minority of children. pediatric smile is possible and has all the advantages of smile surgery, and it has special advantages in pediatric population, especially because it's safe and it doesn't have any flap complications, no haze or regression as PRK has, and of course no complications of intraocular surgery as in refractive lens exchange and phakic fibers. Hypermetropic correction is not possible as yet. The aim is to improve, and perfection may not be possible and is not a must in these cases. You have to remember that. And you also have to remember that you have to follow up with glasses for residual refractive error, and also occlusion therapy and close follow-ups is very crucial, and motivation of the parents is also very crucial. So with that, I come to the end of my presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Susan, for an excellent presentation and excellent video. It was a wonderful case. I would like to ask a few questions. Anybody in, I think in the audience, was the youngest child you have done? Because I just saw that you had done a 5-year-old, and then how did you do the multiple pachymetric measurements? Like?
So in those cases, you have to do it under GA. So you have the ultrasound probe and you do it under GA, and you do it on multiple spots. And that's how you do it, and you take multiple readings basically. Even on the same spot, you take multiple readings so that you get as accurate a measurement as possible.
So you do it at the same time when you have taken, or you do separate GAs? Like
you do it at the same time. Also, if you're doing an examination under anesthesia for other reasons,
you can do that also. Okay.
And yeah, so you could do it at the same sitting, but generally it's preferable to do it earlier so that you can plan better.
So how much amount of astigmatism? You said you have not, you don't do astigmatic correction. So which age group do you start doing the astigmatic correction? Like
so
when I think better centration.
Astigmatism correction is concerned, if you're at a higher age, let's say the child is about 15 years. Which is basically where you consider the pediatric age group to end, and the child is considered as an adult medically at least. But if you've got a child who's about 15 years old, they generally are cooperative. But then you have to assess clinically whether this particular child is cooperative or not, because the personalities of children do vary. There's some children who you find very stoic, very cooperative, even as young as 9 years old. 8 and 9-year-old children, sometimes you find they're absolutely fine. And one very simple test that I do in the outpatient department, which helps me kind of figure out whether this child is going to cooperate for refractive surgery or not, is just basically go near the child and touch the conjunctiva or touch a sclera. And if you see a response where, the minute you're approaching, the child is just suddenly backing off, and then, he's not allowing you to touch his eye and all that, then that is not a cooperative child. That child would have some problems during surgery. So you need to be prepared for that. But you'll see many children, they don't. Not many. Okay, there are a good population of children, and they're generally, children who are more from the village, who are possibly of a slightly, sorry to say this, of a slower socioeconomic status, who generally, are very, very cooperative.
Very cooperative, exactly.
Yeah. You go and touch there on the conjunctiva, and you see that they're absolutely standing still and allowing you to do that. That kind of child is likely to cooperate well. And then the other thing is, pre-operative is very, very important to, get a rapport established with that child. You have to make him think that you're his friend. So you talk to him, joke with him, play around with him a bit. Tell him, look, this is what we are going to do. You're going to see this light. It's very simple. You just feel a pressure here. And then generally I touch him on his shoulder and show, this is what you're going to feel, and things like that. So closer to the age of 15, I might take a risk and do it under local. But if it is a younger child, then I preferably do it under GA. And anyway, we have a Venflon and IV line fixed, and the anesthetic is there. So that if the child is not able to cooperate, even when the docking, so you will come to know by the time you're docking whether this child is going to cooperate. So if you feel that he's not cooperative while he's docking, then you have the Venflon there, and the anesthetist just gives some IV medications.
So you have had centration errors, and when you have them, what do you...
It is generally not that difficult to center, because the child is under anesthesia. So you have to make the plane of anesthesia is good. So you can always hold with the forceps and try to get it as centered as possible. You may not get perfect centration, but you saw in that pentacam, you do get decent centration. And that's generally possible. And also the other important thing you have to remember is it's not perfection that you're looking for. Sometimes you can't get it. And what you might gain is probably, you need to balance the two and figure out whether what you gain is more than what you lose.
Very nice way to end. I have a last one. Why not in hyperopes? Because can we do something else for the hyperope? Because they are the ones which have more problematic. They get more dense amblyopia.
Yeah, I know.
And that's
So Smile is, I mean, LASIK is being done for hypermetropes.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
That is being done. Smile currently does not support hyperopia as a treatment. It supports only myopia and astigmatism. But as I said, the
So do
clinical
you do LASIK for the hyperopes, and what amount of?
well, we've done a lot of cases previously. I think we have a published case report also in JCRS where we've done for all these cases LASIK. But since we started doing Smile, we do more of these only Smiles because we found it to be much more predictable in terms of ease and less post-op complications as compared to LASIK. So, however, the point I wanted to make was that hyperopic Smile is in clinical trials. So the machines, Visumax, which is from Zeiss, has already got that software in, where the myopic smile lenticule is like that. So it's, thicker in the center and thinner to the periphery. Whereas for hyperopic, now they've done the reverse configuration, where it's thinner in the center and thicker out to the periphery. And so hyperopic treatment may soon become available commercially. But remember that refractive surgery for hyperopia has never been as successful for myopia.
Exactly, yeah. For myopia.
In terms of LASIK or whatever you do, because of so many issues, you have to have a much wider optic zone, you have remodeling of the cornea that happens, and so many things. So it's never been as successful. So that hyperopia is always going to be a challenge, I think, just as presbyopia is going to be.
Thank you so much, Dr. Susan. I think there's some hope for these parents who sometimes always ask us, like, can we go in for the LASIK? Or so now we can recommend and we can say that what are the options if the child is not at all going for any patching therapy, or if they're not wearing glasses, because these are a lot of compliance issues in these children, especially in very, very high myopes and unilateral high myopes. But when there is you have done any child, like you get a very high myopic shift after we put an intraocular lens in small children, and sometimes we get a very high myopic shift.
I haven't done that.
Because that's sometimes where your prediction error, like suppose you put an intraocular lens in a 6-month baby or 8-month baby, and sometimes you get these surprises, and you want to do refractive correction in these children. Have you?
I personally haven't done that as yet, but I don't see any reason why you should not. You could possibly do it, provided that it's not a multifocal IOL or a IOL with
not in small. We're not putting multifocal in very small babies.
Just there are now studies where I'm not for it, but there are people who put multifocals also. And also now you have this new iHands, which is the
the accommodative IOLs.
So those kind of lenses may become more popular in the future. But when you put these kind of lenses, probably not as much a problem with iHands, but definitely with multifocals and all those things, is that you'll have different kind of. They all have multifocality, and if you don't have exactly coincident multifocalities on the cornea and the lens, that will become an issue. So if you have a normal lens which has been put in the back, then you could possibly definitely think of, and if you have a pupil that's centered, no pupillary abnormalities. If it's a good-looking eye, then you could consider a refractive surgery for high myopia in these patients also.
So shall I?
Yes, sure. Dr. Manjula, I think, please.
See, this anisometropia over 6 diopters will produce anisoconia.
Exactly.
So those are the cases where you have to go for either contact lens or refractive surgery. Anything under 6 diopter difference will not cause you a problem. Your patching or your conventional amblyopia therapy will give a result. Over 6 diopters, even if you do patching, it will not give you a result unless you correct the anisometropia by contact lenses or refractive surgery. Suppose the child is not compliant with contact lenses, you have not left with options other than for doing for refractive surgery. And even for refractive surgery, as Susan said, in this case, she reduced the -10 completely. But sometimes the child may have -14, -15. We don't have to completely negate it to 0. If you bring it under 6 diopters, is more than enough. You can use glasses for the residual refractive error and go ahead with your amblyopia treatment. So under 6 diopter is not an obstacle to amblyopia treatment.
Exactly.
That is the point I want to drive home to pediatric ophthalmologists.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think very well.
Very well said. Mr. Oli, you wanted to say something? I think we are running short of time, but please.
Yes, especially in cases of axial anisometrope, I don't think so that anisoconia is very common. That can be managed even in spectacle. So only cases where there is more of refractive in nature, then refractive surgeries are primarily indicated. What our experience is, because we do a lot of anisoconic evaluation for all these amblyopic kids, and we observe that if it is axial in nature, then the amount of anisoconia is very less.
No, but your glasses will produce the anisoconia. See, when they wear a high myopic glasses, suppose it's -9 and -2, that -9 will cause minification of image, won't it cause? So that is the anisoconia we are talking about. So with the -9, even if you give a correct correction of -9, that child is not going to use that eye. It's a deterrent for amblyopia therapy. You have to change the size of the image. The minification should be not there. So you can do that only with contact lenses or refractive surgery. Otherwise, it's going to exist in real time.
Okay.
Dr. Susan,
Okay.
how long you have followed up these cases with anisoconia?
Actually, our original study, which was on LASIK, was a very old study. I don't remember. It must be about.
In what age?
I don't remember the age. But the SMILE patients, we would have had. We've got a follow up of about 4 years now. I think 4 years is a follow-up.
Range of the years, age group.
5 was the youngest, 15 was the oldest.
So 5 to 15, she has said in the paper. Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't been adventurous enough to try it under smaller children as yet, you know. But yeah, 5 to 15 is.
They are doing, I keep seeing Susan's cases, they're doing well. The only thing is like there will be some progression of myopia, which we have to explain the parents, especially in smaller children. They would have corrected at 6 years, but you're going to see the child up to 16 years or 18 years. The myopia still has scope for progression. But once that amblyogenic age is got through, I think we are dealing with the obstacle to amblyopia treatment. That's what we are looking at.
Yeah.
So
then you go in
that,
again?
Yeah, after
suppose
that,
if there is progression, does she go in again and ablate or something? Or
no, basically,
how much is the progression?
So we start on anti-myopia progression therapy, like atropinization or glasses or, you know, those kind of things, rather than going again and re-ablating again.
Yeah, so you have to be a little careful about re-ablation and things like that, because you know these are children. When you re-ablate, you have different optics and things like that. So the preference would be not to do anything till the child has attained refractive stability. So you do the first treatment, then treat with glasses. By the time the child may become older also, and possibly by the time he reaches 10 to 12 years old, he may become more contact lens tolerant also. So, you know, you have ways to kind of postpone the, any second treatment till you attain refractive stability, because you cannot keep doing this over and over again. So yeah, you wait till you've got refractive stability, and then you see if you have got sufficient corneal thickness left behind, only then can you do a second treatment also. That's another thing that you have to think about. So you have to reevaluate when he's old enough and then decide whether you can or cannot do.
Have you come across any surprises for the corneal thickness in the later age group?
No, I think the corneal thickness remains the same only. You have some amount of variation which you always have between inter-machine measurements and inter-time measurements. But otherwise, it's okay. You, of course, will still have all the problems associated with post-LASIK ectasia, and also you have to keep all those in mind, especially considering that these are also very younger children, so they have a higher tendency to develop ectasias as opposed to older children where the, you know, cross-linking is older adults where cross-linking starts. The younger children, the corneas are really soft. So you have to keep them on a close follow-up. That's extremely important, and you have to use all your what should I say, your wisdom and your clinical sense before you decide whether this child is fit for refractive surgery and whether you're going to be doing more harm or more benefit.
Thank you. I think we should end the session now. I thank the participants for waiting for 2 hours, and I thank the speakers for excellent presentations. And I think we should end the session now. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I thank the IT department.
Thank you. Thanks, Dr. Suma. Thanks, Manjula, for having invited me.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Oli, for coming in. Thank you, Dr. Prachi.
Thank
you, Dr. Sovita. And I think behind